Hello friends, my name is JJ, beloved million subscriber YouTuber and guy who has been doing this for 10 years, if you can believe that. And in honor of these two historic milestones, I thought today we would revisit a classic JJ topic, which is political systems of the world. One of my first ever successful videos was about weirdest systems of government on Earth, and today I thought it might be interesting to revisit this question in a broader way. Like, what even is a political system? This is a question that can be hard to answer, so let's start by looking at how other people have. Over at Freedom House, which is a non-profit group that monitors political rights around the world, you can see that they have sorted all of the countries of the world into 3 categories based on what sort of political system they have: free, partly free, or not free. Pretty clean and simple. However, according to the Democracy Matrix Research Project of the University of Würzburg, Germany, there are actually 5 different categories: working democracy, efficient democracy, hybrid regime, moderate autocracy, and hard autocracy. The famous Economist Intelligence Unit, put out by the Economist magazine, meanwhile, has 8 designations across 4 categories: 3 grades of authoritarian regime, 2 grades of hybrid regime, 2 grades of flawed democracy, and then a single grade of full democracy. And then there's the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, which has no fewer than 10 ranks on their democracy to autocracy spectrum, with the worst being a closed autocracy, followed by closed autocracy plus, then electoral autocracy plus, then plain electoral autocracy, then electoral autocracy minus, then electoral democracy minus, then electoral democracy plain, then electoral democracy plus, and then finally liberal democracy minus and liberal democracy. And lastly, we got my arch nemesis, Wikipedia, which somehow manages to outdo even that, with a staggering 12 types of political regime, which we will just run through quickly: constitutional monarchy, semi-constitutional monarchy, absolute monarchy, a parliamentary republic, presidential republic, parliamentary republic with executive president, semi-presidential republic, assembly independent republic, theocratic republic, one-party state, military, junta, and countries that basically lack any functioning government at all, or as they put it, a system of government that is in transition or turmoil. So as you see, clearly not the easiest question in the world to answer. The 8 billion people of Earth live under somewhere between 3 and 12 different forms of government, so that's not particularly helpful. Let us see if we can do better. So to begin, I think it can be useful if we can get a sense of the bigger picture here. Why exactly do we want to keep track of political systems in the first place? I think most people would say it is because we want to have some accurate understanding of the state of human rights and freedoms in our world, and to track the progress that we, as members of the human race, are collectively making towards what I would hope are broadly shared goals of minimizing the existence of things like war, suffering, and oppression on this planet. In an interconnected world, it is likewise useful to be able to appreciate people from different countries as products of unique political circumstances, and to be able to identify which countries are the most dangerous or dysfunctional for all sorts of economic, humanitarian, or just practical reasons. And on that front of these various systems, I would say that the Wikipedia list is probably the least useful. In fairness to Wiki, this is because they are not in the business of monitoring the state of human rights or democracy around the world. They like to think of themselves as a repository of neutral, fact-based information, and as a result, their system of government list is the most unambiguous and literal. They focus on the way that the constitutions of the various countries are written and just summarize the structure of whatever political institutions they have. So if a country has a king or queen, it is some kind of monarchy. If a country has a president, it's some kind of republic. And then it's just mostly a matter of adjudicating how much power the monarch or president theoretically has relative to other parts of the government. This is the sort of thing that is most interesting as a matter of trivia and it is what I talked about in that last video. You know, like, oh, in this country, their leader is called a Grand Duke. The problem with this method of classification, however, is that it is both too narrow and too broad. So like Australia, Italy, and Portugal are all first world democracies, yet the Wikipedia list classifies them as 3 different things because one is a constitutional monarchy and the other 2 are 2 slightly different forms of parliamentary republics. But then they also classify Russia and France, 2 countries with vastly different political situations, as having the same system simply because they have an executive president who is independent of the legislature. This sort of overly literal classification really allows a lot of undemocratic countries to skate on any sort of judgment so long as their system is set up in a certain way. Like sure, China and Cuba get singled out for being one-party states because they have a unique communist form of government. And a few countries get this light green color because they're literally run by the military. But most other undemocratic governments are just classified on the basis of what their constitutions say on paper. In other words, this institution-based sorting system makes no effort to acknowledge how a country's constitution works in practice, or even if it is ignored altogether. Like in the case of Russia, you could easily argue that their legislature isn't really independent from the president at all, with the Russian legislature instead, in practice, usually characterized as being little more than a rubber stamp on whatever the president wants. And we contrast that to France, where the president and the legislature actually do act as meaningful checks and balances on each other. Likewise, look at their map of South America. The big outlier country is not the Venezuelan dictatorship, as you might assume, but Peru, because in Peru they have a prime minister and a president, which apparently makes them a semi-presidential regime. Any system of political classification that values these sorts of subtle things over more fundamental questions of tyranny and freedom does not strike me as one that is providing particularly useful information. The Freedom House system, on the other hand, feels a little too blunt. Their 3 categories are a bit too definitive and judgmental, which can make it hard to get a clear sense of what's actually going on in any particular country. For instance, while it is true that Turkey has an authoritarian leader who has been consolidating power for a while, does it really deserve to be in the same category as North Korea? Is Thailand really as bad as Saudi Arabia? Not free is a very broad category that they use to encompass everything from totalitarian dictatorships to just places with high degrees of political corruption and turmoil. The Freedom House people do write more detailed reports justifying these classifications, with their political analysis focusing on the degree that the people running the country in question were democratically elected and whether those elections were free and fair, and a variety of other human rights concerns. But again, these more detailed reports just paint pictures of countries with political situations that are far more complicated than the simple free-unfree dichotomy can portray. And I mean, partly free doesn't seem particularly sufficient either. It's hard to instinctively know what it means that Hungary and Mexico are partly free, while Pakistan and Iraq are unfree. All of these places have elections and democratically elected leaders, but apparently at some point, corrupting variables overshadow a democratic system and produce unfreedom. This would suggest that The Economist and the 2 university studies are the best, since they offer multiple grades on a freedom to tyranny spectrum, which allows for more nuanced classifications. But that said, I still feel like it is worth acknowledging at least some institutional variables when you're talking about whether a country is democratic or authoritarian. Because again, I think that a fierce dictatorship under the rule of a guy who's been in power for multiple decades is a system unique enough to deserve explicit distinction from just authoritarian, which can describe a lot of bad forms of government below a literal dictatorship. Okay, and now having analyzed all of these different systems, I am now ready to unveil a system of my own. Ta-da! The patented JJ political classification system prioritizes describing the countries of the world with labels that would be most useful to the average person seeking to understand the politics of a particular place. So my categories are strongman rule or dictatorship, other broadly unfree country, established democracy, struggling democracy, and completely politically dysfunctional. Okay, now I will describe each one. So, an established democracy is basically just a country that has had unbroken democratic government for many, many decades. There is a small bundle of countries that can say that they've been democratic for upwards of 80 or even past 100 years, which includes Western Europe, Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Then there are some countries that became democratic more recently, but are generally recognized as meeting a pretty high democratic standard, like Taiwan, South Korea, South Africa, Uruguay, Chile, and parts of Eastern Europe. I was looking at the average rankings of some of the other systems for this data, by the way. Struggling democracies, by contrast, are places that have either only established a democratic system of government over the last few decades, or have had democracy for a while, but are consistently given poor marks by critics for the persistent presence of things like fraud, corruption, violence, and suppression of rights in their elections, political parties, and lawmaking. Places that meet this criteria would be basically the majority of countries in Latin and South America, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Mongolia in Asia, a handful of countries in Africa, and Ukraine, Romania, and the Balkan countries in Europe. Now, this is obviously the most subjective category of political system, and even looking through these multiple serious academic studies, they often can't seem to agree as to when precisely a country officially crosses the line from just being a broadly bad democracy that routinely undermines civil rights and constitutional rules, and an outright unfree society where these things don't meaningfully exist at all. And as well, a lot of the times that the criteria that they use to determine when a democracy is deficient in some way are incredibly vague. For example, here are a couple of the questions that the scholars at The Economist were asking when they were gauging the health of a country's democracy. Is potential access to public office open to all citizens? Is the functioning of government open and transparent with sufficient public access to information? Do ethnic, religious, and other minorities have a reasonable degree of autonomy and voice in the political process? I think cynics in almost any country could answer no to some or all of those questions, but getting an accurate understanding of international politics requires an ability to put the failings of each individual country into its appropriate global contexts, which can be quite challenging. I mean, all democracies are imperfect in some ways, and for experts to attempt to gauge the degree those imperfections actively matter is always a very controversial undertaking. And this is why so many of these reports use a spectrum rather than hard in or out classifications. All this stuff about hybrid regimes. I mean, the VDEM report quite literally puts a bunch of democracies in what they call the gray zone. For me, I think the most important thing for the average person to know is just whether a country is on some level going through the motions of operating as a democratic society, with free elections, free speech, a free press, and all of that. Christopher Hitchens used to call this the as-if test. Do people in a society generally conduct themselves as if they were living in an advanced democracy with all of the rights and freedoms that that entails? Or do they live timid lives in which everyone is always warning each other not to do this or that because the government is watching and you could get in a lot of trouble? It's easy to be pessimistic about the state of democracy in the world these days, and certainly a lot of the groups that do these sorts of studies often put out dramatic headlines about the democratic backsliding that defines this era. But at the same time, I think it is worth remembering that even now, most countries are at least trying or pretending to be democratic in some way. And as the Wikipedia map shows, most countries have governments that are at least theoretically set up in a way that resembles the established democracies. This was actually the argument that Francis Fukuyama made when he was talking about the end of history. Today, we see very few countries that are actively proposing a form of government that is substantially different from some sort of liberal democratic system where the people elect politicians in competitive elections and there are checks and balances and constitutional rights and all the rest. Some places are obviously doing it worse, but hopefully my map gives you an accurate picture of who is at least making the attempt. All right, and for the next category, I classify a country that is under the rule of a strongman or dictator as one that's been run by the same guy for over 7 years and is classified by the others as being broadly unfree. Countries that are comparatively unfree but haven't had a government dominated by a single guy for 7 years or more are just classified as being unfree in my system. The purpose of making this distinction is because I think that unfree governments that are headed by the same person for an extended length of time tend to have a different character than unfree societies where the leaders change more frequently. Once the same guy has held unchecked power for over 7 straight years, the government starts to become more inseparable from his particular agenda and personality. The apparatus of the government becomes set up to fundamentally accommodate his wants in particular, as opposed to just the office of the ruler. A ruler of an unfree society who can remain in power for more than 7 years is someone who has clearly consolidated authority into his person and brought stability to the political system, and will, in all likelihood, probably remain in power for many more years to come. Whatever elections are occurring at that point are probably being rigged to some degree or another, because the system can no longer handle the possibility of somebody else being in charge. I don't think it really matters if this sort of country is officially set up as a monarchy or republic or one-party state or military regime or what. In practice, all systems of one-man rule have way more similarities than differences. When we study the 20th century, the fact that, say, General Franco and Fidel Castro came to power under 2 differently structured constitutional systems is ultimately less important than the fact that these were 2 men running highly centralized governments where their word and their word alone was law. Not all unfree political regimes are necessarily dictatorships, but all dictatorships arise in unfree regimes. I went with 7 years as my standard, just because most democratic countries tend to cap the length of a single term in office at less than 7 years. A guy who stays in office for longer than 7 years thus feels like someone who has officially passed an internationally recognized standard for a long time. The reason I called this category strongman or dictatorship is just because I think that dictator is a kind of dramatic word that evokes an image of a very brutal 20th century tyrant like Hitler or Stalin or Mao Zedong that is less common these days. I mean, there are certainly some very wicked and oppressive leaders in our modern world, like Putin in Russia, Lukashenko in Belarus, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and Colonel Obiang in Equatorial Guinea. But other strongman rulers are much less nightmarish while still being the unchecked ruler of a broadly unfree society. Someone like Erdogan in Turkey or President Museveni in Uganda. By my count, there are 31 countries in this world that can be described as being under the rule of a dictator or strongman by my standard, with 15 of them being under the rule of the same leader for 20 years or more. I guess you could call those dictatorships plus. I think the ambiguity in the title helps clarify that there is a spectrum to these things too, while also clarifying that one thing that, say, Turkey and North Korea do have in common is that their political system is dominated by one man who's been in power for quite a while. Now, countries that are unfree but not dictatorships, by contrast, are those where the current leader has not been in power for very long. Sometimes this is because the previous longtime dictator has only recently died or resigned, as is the case in Turkmenistan or Algeria or Cuba. Sometimes it's because leaders in that country just change relatively frequently as a matter of course. But despite the lack of a single strongman who's been running the show for ages, the overall political system of these places remains very oppressive, with laws limiting things like freedom of speech and political organization, and a government and security system that makes widespread use of violence, censorship, and arbitrary arrest against its own people. This category would describe places like Vietnam, Iraq, Thailand, and Ethiopia, none of which have been run as literal one-man dictatorships in quite a while, but remain places where democratic rights remain quite tightly restricted, regardless of how often the leader changes. And then my final category is politically dysfunctional. This is my way of identifying countries where the political situation is basically too unstable, chaotic, transient, or uncertain to call anything else. Most of the time, this will be because the country recently had some sort of coup or uprising that overthrew the previous government, And it's still too early to tell what sort of regime that country will wind up having in the long term. For example, the 2020s have seen a string of military coups in Africa, deposing their presidents and setting up some sort of interim governing committee, usually with a pompous name like the National Council for the Safeguarding of the Fatherland. We could think of the recent coups in Syria and Afghanistan as being similar. Now, history informs us that coups and revolutions usually end with some sort of long-term dictatorship being established. And in some of these places, there's already signs that that's the plan. But it's not always the case. Sometimes interim governments do indeed wind up being interim. And after a few years, they transition into some sort of democratic system, and the coup leaders gracefully step aside, so we can give them the benefit of the doubt for a couple of years, although something tells me that Afghanistan's fate is probably pretty set at this point. And then there are places like Haiti, Somalia, and Libya that are notorious for having basically collapsed governments that are extremely weak, contested, and unable to exert authority over the entirety of the country. Experts often struggle to categorize the nature of politics in these countries, since there comes a point at which a country is so torn apart by upheaval and social breakdown that it is barely a country at all anymore. All of these yellow countries are regarded as being broadly unfree, as places in a state of political turmoil and collapsed institutions tend to be. But it's worth noting that in these sorts of situations, the state of unfreedom is defined by things like an absence of a clear constitution or laws, and a stable government able to enforce them, which then allows other authority structures like gangs, militias, or the army to fill the vacuum. And this is qualitatively different from a powerful tyrannical government actively enforcing oppression upon the people, as is the case in most other unfree places. So, let me know what you think about my system. Obviously, it's not perfect, and I'm sure you'll be able to think of countries where my categorization doesn't quite feel right. But if there is one thing I've learned from this exercise, it's that this sort of thing is never an exact science. But if you just want to get the gist of the political state of the world, I think this isn't a bad guide. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.